Chapter 3, the biological bases of behavior. Basic questions we're going to be looking at Lecture 1. What are the major divisions and their functions of the human nervous system? What are the various structures and functions of the neuron? What is a neural impulse, otherwise known as an action potential? What's a synapse? What are the basic processes that take place there? What are neurotransmitters? How are they related to behavior? So we'll start with Alonzo Clemens. Alonzo Clemens, as a young child, suffered a trauma to his head. Thereafter, as he matured, it was clear that he was extraordinary. Alonzo Clemens can look at an animal and create a perfect three-dimensional replica in clay. Can't do it with humans, but he can do it with animals, which is interesting, but has no explanation. So there's something going on in Alonzo Clemens' brain that ultimately, if you believe in the methods of science, can be discovered that explains how he's able to do this incredible thing. Alonzo Clemens is known as a savant. He's one of a handful alive today that can do extraordinary things, but are also limited in some ways. Alonzo Clemens has been institutionalized most of his life. He has severe cognitive and language impairments. So in one sense, he's extraordinary in his abilities, his artistic abilities, and in the other sense, he's incapacitated. He cannot function in a way that we would ordinarily believe to be an adaptive way in society. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the biological bases. In Chapter 2, you learned about the fundamental assumption of science is that things operate according to some order. And you also learned about the basic goals of science, that is, to understand, predict, and in some instances, apply and control human behavior. So individuals that are interested in a biological basis are interested in understanding the physiological, the biological, organic underpinnings of thought, feeling, and behavior. So we're going to start by looking at the components of the nervous system. The two most basic components are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the CNS, or the central nervous system, contains the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system contains everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. So in this particular lecture, we're going to be looking at the peripheral nervous system, and then in lecture 2, we're going to be looking at the central nervous system. Have you ever been stung by a bee? The first time I was stung by a bee, I was working on a fuel dock as a teenager in a marina. I grabbed a line that was holding the boat to the dock, and there was a yellow jacket in the exact place I put my hand, and sure enough, I got stung, and it hurt. So how does that work? How does the experience of pain eventuate from a sting that's some distance from the brain? Well, it involves the action of the human nervous system that we're going to take a look at. So the peripheral nervous system is everything that exists outside of the brain and the spinal cord. There's two basic divisions of the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. There's two basic divisions of the peripheral nervous system, that is the somatic and the autonomic. So we'll take a look at the somatic first. The somatic nervous system contains what are called afferent and efferent nerves. Think of the afferent nerves as those nerves that are dedicated to carrying information, that is the neural impulse, which we'll talk about in a minute, from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. So for example, when that bee stung me in my hand, there's sensory receptors for pain in my hand. Those sensory receptors created a neural impulse, a little bit of information, a little spark of energy that traveled up those afferent nerves to my brain. The efferent nerves carry the neural impulse out to the skeletal muscles and glands. They control voluntary movement. So when I pulled my hand away, almost reflexively, that reflects the action of the efferent nerves. So the afferent nerves carry information such as pain to the brain. The efferent nerves carry information away from the central nervous system that tell the muscles to do something, and also the glands. So the adrenal glands kick in and stimulate a sympathetic response of fight or flight. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system has its own subdivisions, that is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. Think of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system as that part of your nervous system that's active in times of stress. So when I was stung by a bee, you can say that it kicked in my sympathetic nervous system. It prepared me to either flee or fight. And that's a basic sympathetic response. So the sympathetic nervous system is active when we're under acute stress. The parasympathetic is active when we're in a state of relaxation. So when you're taking a snooze, when you're meditating, when you're relaxing, the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant. So those are the two basic divisions of the peripheral nervous system: the somatic, which contains the afferent nerves and the efferent nerves, and the autonomic, which contains the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Concept check for you. So name the division of the autonomic nervous system that is likely to be active when. Here's the first situation. You're walking down a dark alley after watching a scary movie. Well, think about what's going on physically. Maybe your heart rate has increased, respiration has grown shallow and rapid. Maybe you're perspiring a bit, maybe your hands are cold and clammy. So you're in an acute sympathetic response, fight or flight, stress response, so that would be the sympathetic nervous system. How about when you're on the beach relaxing and enjoying the sunset? What part of the autonomic nervous system is active? That would be the parasympathetic. So sympathetic, think fight or flight. Parasympathetic, think relaxation. The human nervous system is made up of billions of these little guys known as neurons. So you're looking at an image of a single neuron. So let's talk about the neuron. The neuron is the basic building block of the human nervous system. Think of the neuron as a tiny battery that's capable of producing a spark of electricity. That's the neural impulse I referred to in the previous slides. So when the neuron is inactive, a tiny negative electrical charge exists within the neuron, and this is called a resting potential. When it's active, there's a shift known as depolarization, in which the interior of the neuron becomes less negative and more positive. And it's as a result of this depolarization process that there's a tiny spark of electricity created, and this is known as the action potential, also called the neural impulse. So it's the depolarization that creates that spark of energy. This is an artist's rendering of a network of neurons, and we're going to look at the different parts of the neuron and sort of trace the path of a neural impulse. So let's start up here, upper left. Here's a neuron structure extending away from that neuron down here and seemingly connecting with an adjacent neuron. So we're going to look at the different parts of the neuron. So this part here, we're looking at the lower right, is the cell body of the neuron, contains the nucleus and everything that makes the cell go. That's known as the soma. Extending away from the soma are structures known as dendrites. So the dendrites are structures that receive information. That is, they receive the neural impulse that's coming from an adjacent neuron. So let's take a look over here at this neuron. So that neural impulse, that actual potential, that tiny spark of electricity, travels down this long structure, and that long structure is known as an axon. So the role of the axon is to transmit the neural impulse from neuron to neuron. These cells that you see here are Schwann cells that comprise what's called the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath aids in the conduction, the efficient conduction of the neural impulse along the axon. Think of it as insulation around an electrical wire. Maintains the signal, so to speak. And then these little structures down here, we'll look at a close-up in a minute, are what are called terminal buttons. The terminal buttons, even though it looks like they're connecting with the dendrite of the adjacent neuron, they're not. There's actually a very, very thin gap between the terminal button and the dendrite, known as the synaptic cleft. We'll look at that in a minute. But that's a very, very important junction. What happens there is known as the synapse, which is crucial in the transmission of the neural impulse from one neuron to the next. So those are the parts of the neuron that you'll need to know something about and their functions. So generally we're not interested in the action of single neurons. Mainly we're interested in neural networks. So in your brain, there's vast networks of neurons that are all linked together and doing their own particular things. So neural networks are really where the action is. Understanding those clusters of neurons that are responsible for particular things. Concept check. An action potential is A, an electrical signal that travels along the postsynaptic button of a neuron. B, the small gap that exists between adjacent neurons. C, an electrical signal that travels along the axon of a neuron. D, the tiny electrical charge that exists when a neuron is neither receiving nor sending information. The answer is C, an electrical signal that travels along the axon of a neuron. D, which is the attractive distractor, is actually a resting potential. So let's talk about the synapse. So what you're looking at here in this image is an axon coming down, and then this structure is the terminal button. And then this is the dendrite of the adjacent neuron. So we're going to look at what's going on in this little gap right here. And this event is known as the synapse. Here's an electron microscope image of synapses on a single neuron. So literally there's trillions and trillions of synapses going on in your brain as you're watching this lecture. So there's a 5-step process I want to cover. The first step is synthesis and storage of the neurotransmitters. And these are chemical substances that your body produces that are responsible for various things. And we'll look at that in a minute. But for now, let's take a look at these little sacs. These little sacs store the neurotransmitters. That's step 1. So they're synthesized and stored. Step 2, the neural impulse comes down, reaches the terminal button, and triggers the release of the neurotransmitters into this gap right here known as the synaptic cleft. This is a microns thin gap. The neurotransmitters flood across the synaptic cleft, and this is step 3. They bind with what are called receptor sites on the adjacent neuron. And these receptor sites are specific for particular neurotransmitters. Step 4, enzymes flood into the synaptic cleft that facilitate step 5, which is the reuptake of the neurotransmitters into the terminal button for reuse. And this is the 5-step process underpinning the synapse. So what happens here is crucial to the propagation or the failure to propagate the neural impulse from one neuron to the next. So what happens here at the synapse is absolutely crucial for pretty much everything we think, feel, and do. So a little bit about neurotransmitters and behavior. So these are those chemical substances produced by the body that are released into the synaptic cleft and bind with receptor sites. So the first one here is acetylcholine. This was the first neurotransmitter to be discovered. It's primarily functioning in skeletal muscle movement. So your ability to move your large skeletal muscles is attributable to the presence of acetylcholine. Many of these neurotransmitters are implicated in other behaviors, attention and possibly memory, for example. acetylcholine apparently plays a role in these behaviors. There's a class of neurotransmitters known as the monoamines. Dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine are the ones that you're going to need to know something about. And we're going to look at each one of these quickly. So dopamine you can think of as that neurotransmitter that supports our ability to execute smooth, controlled movements. So people with Parkinson's disease have symptoms that involve severe tremors, and partly these tremors are attributable to dysfunction at dopamine receptor sites. So dopamine replacement therapy is one of the effective treatments of the symptoms of Parkinson's. Seemingly, if you boost dopamine levels in the brains of people suffering from Parkinson's, it has the effect of reducing those tremors. Also implicated in the experience of positive emotions. So cocaine, for example, is a drug that binds with the exact receptor sites that dopamine does. Also, I want to mention that the dopamine hypothesis has been one of the most durable hypotheses for the presence of schizophrenia. Seemingly overactivity at dopamine receptor sites can contribute to the symptoms of schizophrenia. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, functions in sleep, wakefulness, eating, aggressive behavior, also plays a role in depression. Norepinephrine, that neurotransmitter functions in the stress response, otherwise known as adrenaline. So when you're stung by a bee and you go into that acute sympathetic response, that's reflecting the role of norepinephrine. Also plays a role in the regulation of mood and a role in depression. So serotonin and norepinephrine are implicated in depression. And in part, and we won't get to this until chapter 15, but in part the way that antidepressants work is by making more serotonin and norepinephrine available at the level of the synapse. Evidently, that reduces the symptoms of depression. The last one I want to mention are the endorphins. So the endorphins are sometimes referred to as the body's endogenous opiates. So endorphins are a class of neurotransmitters that bind with the same receptor sites as opiates like morphine. The science behind the discovery of endorphins is rather interesting. Much of the research was funded after soldiers were coming home from Vietnam, and it was discovered that many of them had addiction problems, narcotics primarily. And so there was a lot of money available for conducting research into the effect of morphine and other narcotics on the brain, and it was discovered that narcotics have the effect because they bind with receptor sites that are specific to these endorphins. So your body essentially has a built-in painkiller. That is the role of the endorphins. So think about it. From an adaptive standpoint, it makes sense. An evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. That if we're terribly mauled by a lion when we're out hunting, we would have the capacity to kill the pain such that we were able to crawl back into our cave and possibly heal. So if you buy into the theory of evolution, and there's evidence to suggest that this is likely the case, we've got our own built-in pain reduction system because it served us well. That is, it helped us live long enough to pass our genes on to the next generation. Sometimes it's known as runner's high when people stress their bodies to the point where they feel high, and this is attributable to the effects of the endorphin. So runner's high, weightlifters can also have this. Anything that exerts the tremendous stress on the body, whether it's an athletic or other event, can sometimes give you a kind of a high, and that's the effect of the endorphins. Concept check here. A good analogy for the way in which a neurotransmitter binds to a receptor site is A, a key fitting the lock of a door, B, the lowering of a drawbridge, C, the opening and closing of a window, D, the pulling of the trigger of a gun. Correct answer is A, a key fitting the lock of a door. So think of the neurotransmitters as the key and the receptor site on an adjacent dendrite as being the lock. Another concept check. Name that neurotransmitter. So which of the neurotransmitters that we discussed is necessary for large muscle movement? Here's a hint. It was the first neurotransmitter to be discovered. Answer is acetylcholine. How about this one? Which of the monoamines is necessary for fine motor behavior? We talked about 3. Dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. The answer is dopamine. Which of the 2 monoamines have been implicated in depression? Answer is norepinephrine and serotonin. The last one. What do we call our natural painkillers? Those are the endorphins. Alright, so this is what we talked about in this lecture. We talked about the major divisions, those 2 basic divisions, and the functions of the human nervous system. We talked about the various structures and functions of the neuron. We described the neural impulse, that is the resting potential, depolarization, and the action potential, which is that little spark of energy, the neural impulse that travels along axons and goes from neuron to neuron. Described the basic processes that take place at the synapse. We described how neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, the monoamines, and endorphins are related to behavior.